Side 2.
Ted Willis, who was eventually to take his seat in the House of Lords, had, like myself, begun his writing career at Unity Theatre. He went on to play an important role in both its management and repertory. During his time there, he was able to practice his craft as a writer, and with his play Buster, which was transferred to the Arts Theatre, began a successful career as a professional playwright. His beginnings were truly remarkable. For radio, he wrote the first episode of Mrs. Dale's Diary. For the theatre, Woman in a Dressing Gown. For the cinema, The Blue Lamp. And with the coming of television, he created Dixon of Dock Green. It was Ted who, during those early years at Unity, suggested that I had served for long enough my apprenticeship as a writer of political and social satire, songs and musicals, etc., and the time had come to turn my attention to more serious drama. He proposed that I begin with an adaptation for the theatre of The Ragged-Trousered Philanthropists. This was one novel I knew well, given me, as I have said, by my father as a birthday present in my early teens. The book had become a Bible for the organised working class of my youth, and one to which I could instinctively relate, having grown up in the atmosphere of forelock tugging, obeisance, and fear of unemployment. So my first venture as a dramatist, whilst not my own original work, but performed under my own direction, was deemed a great success and came to be regarded as an historic event in the story of Unity Theatre. It was to mark the beginning of almost 20 years of continuing success for me, both as a director and writer at Unity Theatre. I had already flown the parental nest for the very simple reason that with my growing professional work, spending almost every other hour at Unity, my folk hardly ever saw me anyway. Also, I was 26 years of age, and my love life prior to meeting Edith had become very frustrating. For the sake of respectability, I had to show my face at home, but found myself so often having to leave a hot maiden in a warm bed in order to catch a cold all-night bus back to the suburbs. My mother, as always, lent a sympathetic ear to my wish to move out. It was my father, she informed me, who had somewhat querulously inquired, "What does he want to leave home for?" "Because he's a grown man now," she tried to explain patiently. "Well, that doesn't answer my question," he responded. Thinking this somewhat pompous, she decided to close the subject with, "Then I shall have to buy you a book, won't I?" I had taken a room in a friend's Chelsea flat, which was rather cramped, and became even more so when Edith joined me. It was impossible for us both to get out of bed at the same time. We lived in sin until her divorce came through, and then we named the day. If my memory serves me correctly, it was then that Edith was informed her father had cut her from his will. The ceremony in 1946 took place at the Chelsea Registrar's office, but it wasn't a happy day for the bride, I'm afraid. With the exception of a telegram from her mother, the rest of the family ignored the whole event. Then the friend I had asked to be a witness failed to show up. In a panic, I dashed out into the King's Road and grabbed the first person passing by. After I had pleaded my case, he reluctantly agreed to stand in. By this time, my dear parents were somewhat bewildered. They had had a proper wedding in a church with all the formalities, whilst their son's betrothal had about as much pomp and ceremony as the signing of a pantomime contract with the Grade brothers. After a lousy lunch, my mother and father wished us much happiness and departed. We wandered back to our love nest to be informed by my friend that we had to vacate the room within 2 weeks as he had sold the flat. I was not surprised when Edith sat down and wept. But within 2 weeks I had taken over a mortgage, my very first, on a little house near Hampstead Heath. There were no roses round the door, but who needed roses? I had a family all to myself, it seemed to me, and that was enough. Another acquisition of mine about this time was an agent, Meyer and Selznick's, one of the most influential in town. And I joined by their invitation. It transpired that David Henley, an agent in the company, acting on the advice of a client, had ventured into the wilds of Somers Town to see me in a review at Unity Theatre. The signing of an agent's contract duly took place, only to have David Henley tear it up and drop it into the wastepaper basket. Seeing my surprise, he explained, "If I can't get you the work you deserve, then that's all that contract is worth." I knew then that I was in good company, and I was to stay with them until they ceased operations in this country. Not long afterwards, I received a script of the Victorian comedy Cast by Paul Robeson, with the offer of the role of Sam Gerridge. It came through Kitty Black, assistant administrator of the Company of Four, headed by Binky Beaumont, at the Lyric Theatre Hammersmith, where it would be produced. It was to prove to be the turning point in my career. It was a perfect comedy for a post-war pick-me-up, and most assuredly proved to be so, particularly for me. The role of Sam Gerridge fitted me like a glove. Sam, a chirpy young Cockney plumber, along with his sweetheart Polly, played by Brenda Bruce, became the comedy duo of that season. Directed by Peter Ashmore, it was an immediate success, and after our scheduled run at the Lyric, we were sent out on a brief tour whilst arrangements were made for us to return to the West End. That opening night in the West End was my first taste of the magic. The audience that won't let you go, the flowers, the kissing, the tears, the famous and others crowding into one's dressing room, matchbox size on the top floor next to the water cistern, meeting their friends and staying to chat, making it impossible for you to get out of your clothes. A total stranger offering champagne in a tooth mug, saying, "Well done, old boy, hope it's your beaker." And finally, David Henley taking Edith and me to the Savoy Grill after the show. With the signing of a film contract with J. Arthur Rank, and having been cast for my first starring role with Patricia Rock in a film called When the Bough Breaks, there was a sudden demand for my presence at Pinewood Studios, making travelling by train and bus impossible. I just had to have a car. But how? Where from? This was 1947. Cars were generally conspicuous by their absence. One could actually breathe in London in those days. There wasn't a car being produced anywhere in the country at that time. My only chance was to find a garage that might have one in mothballs, preserved for the duration of the war. Well, after what could best be likened to a mafia operation, I was put in touch with a garage that had two. One, a clapped-out Ford that wouldn't have made it to the breaker's yard, and the second, a 1936 Rolls-Royce. Price, £2,000. How such a price would relate to today's market, I don't know, but it was a lot of money for 1947. Over our evening meal, I explained my dilemma to Edith. Her immediate reaction was, "Buy the Rolls-Royce." I protested on economic grounds. She retaliated with, "You've got to have a car. This is an investment." She always sounded so logical when we were in love. I bought the Rolls-Royce on the Never Never, which I once heard my father describe as the vice of the working class. Then came the day all preparations were over. Pre-publicity, the grooming, the makeup, and the camera tests. All the measurements had been taken and materials chosen for my wardrobe, far too expensive for the character I was playing, a corner shop grocer. For the first time, I was being dressed on the ground floor of Berman's, the theatrical costumiers, instead of in the basement with the peasants, where I often ended up wearing Dickie Attenborough's cast-offs. With all this attention, my imagination was running riot. The studio where the film was to be made hadn't yet been named, but I figured it had to be Pinewood. Star dressing room number 2. Right next door to the beautiful Patricia Rock. Me, her leading man. She, my first leading lady. Patricia was an inch or so taller than me, so I had to wear lifts in my shoes. So what? Look what they did for Alan Ladd. My name would be on the door, just under the star. It was all going to be luxurious. I didn't speak from any previous experience, of course. Until then, a dressing room meant sharing with others. Sometimes I might have the odd one to myself, usually the size of a broom cupboard with the loo at the end of the corridor. But not now, Billy boy. No doubt some minion would call to inquire if I preferred lunch in my room or should a reservation be made in the restaurant. Before, I had always eaten in the canteen. Oh, yes, I know my place. But there had been some changes made, and I would now eat in the restaurant. Call in the bar on the way, say hello, buy a drink or two, maybe. But before I sat down to eat, I'd have a few words with my friend Frank Godwin at the high executive table. Of course, no one knew he and I had performed and written sketches together at Unity Theatre. A little stargazing, but this was it. This was the way it was going to be from now on. Of course, space would be reserved for me in the car park for my Rolls Royce. In the event, it turned out that all my imaginings were just that, purely imaginary. This is something I have experienced often in my life and led me to my personal motto: always anticipate the worst. Anything better is a bonus. When the Bow Breaks was not made at Pinewood, instead the old Gainsborough studios in Islington were reopened. They could be likened to a rabbit warren with dressing rooms to match. London was frozen to a standstill. There was a national fuel shortage, and owing to rationing of power, the only means of studio lighting and heating came from an aged generator parked in the street outside. We never used our dressing rooms, they were too cold. There was a one-bar fire in the studio which artistes were supposed to share. That is, if they could squeeze past Patricia and myself. As for the catering, I remember nothing, but perhaps it's just as well. But we did seem to drink a lot of unsweetened cocoa. With the completion in 1947 of When the Bow Breaks, my first film under contract, so began the pressure for me to change my name before its distribution. The main source of complaints stemmed from the United States, where the distributors just would not believe that anyone could be born with a handle such as Robotham, and felt it could have an adverse effect on my box office potential. My first reaction was to refuse on principle. What's good enough for my father, etc., etc. However, after an excellent dinner with Sidney Box, the producer, who, plying me with brandy, explained the logic and dire necessity of not upsetting the Americans, I relented and became Bill Owen, using my first and third Christian names. Legally, my family remain Robothams, but for an actor, I think Sidney was right. It's neat, tidy, and easy to remember. The film had a mixed press reception, being described by some as a weepy. It was about a woman who has an illegitimate baby which she is forced to hand over to a rich, childless couple, then, having married me, wants the child back again. I can't remember whether there was supposed to be something wrong with me. I have to admit it wasn't quite my scene, as a critic confirmed. Bill Owen must be as surprised as we are to find himself playing a romantic lead. It is a fact. I've never kissed a woman passionately in a film in my life, and only once on stage, and that was in a play I wrote myself. Then came the usual publicity jamboree, travelling around the country selling the film, and because of my experience in variety as a solo entertainer, I found myself in great demand, particularly in front of cinema audiences. To walk out onto the stage of one of those giant Odeon or Granada cinemas could be an awesome experience, especially when, having reached the microphone, all you could do was make jolly banter about a film the audience had paid good money to see and were waiting impatiently. I can remember accompanying one rank starlet who had done rather well in her first film. She stood on that vast stage of the Troxy Mile End, joyfully prattling away to a stony silence which was finally broken by a voice booming out of the darkness. "Why don't you piss off?" Collapse of young party. To Edith and me, a son was born on 8th of April 1949. I shall never forget that moment when my father held his grandson for the first time, saying with tears in his eyes, "Well, that's another bill in the family." This wasn't presumption on his part. Naming the first child after the father was long a tradition with working-class people. There had been flowers and congratulations from Edith's parents with an invitation for us to visit them as soon as she was fit enough. It was just prior to the visit to her family in Glasgow that Edith asked me if I would forego the family tradition of naming the first son after his father and have him called Thomas after her father. The phrase she used was, "as a peace offering." This was, as I recall, a reference to their last altercation when she had stormed out of the house for good to join me. So it seemed I was already involved in this rather turbulent relationship before I'd even met her father. But I agreed, kidding myself that it was my duty to try and help heal the family rift, which, I should say, did nothing for my father's bitter disappointment. We were met at the station by a chauffeur-driven limousine and a nanny, hired specially for the occasion, who immediately took charge of little Tom. The house was one of those granite fortress-like buildings that were the hallmark of the well-to-do of Glasgow suburbia. It stood in its own grounds, a quarter of an acre or so, with a pebble drive leading to a rather forbidding front door. A maid answered the bell almost before Edith had rung it, and there waiting to welcome us were Mr. and Mrs. Stevenson, my first and very own in-laws. But it was the bairn that stole the limelight, wee Tommy, the first male child to be born to the Stevenson clan. The large hallway rang with oohs and ahs, "What a bonny lad," etc., etc. Whatever the rank front office envisaged regarding when the bow breaks and what it could do for me and vice versa, my judgment is that they were disappointed for us both. Sidney Box stated to the press that I was a coming star of tomorrow, but I was already beginning to worry about today. No doubt because of his grandson, and in consequence the easing of the relationship between he and Edith, old Tom restored his daughter's private income. Then, to my great surprise, my rank contract was renewed. As it was coming up to our wedding anniversary, Edith decided the treat was on her and we would celebrate at the Caprice. This was the in place for anyone who was anybody in show business. Over coffee, she handed me an envelope containing a cheque for £1,000 and a note which read, "Happy anniversary, darling. Why not invest on the merry-go-round for the next year, my love?" I was speechless at such generosity, almost to the point of embarrassment, and I admitted to being somewhat confused as to its purpose. As always, she came straight to the point. She already had doubts about the film contract. Quoting a publicity blurb, she continued, "If you are to be the British James Cagney, why don't they give you the roles? And if they aren't to be found, have them written." I pointed out this wasn't Hollywood, and there were probably many actors under contract of rank with a similar beef. But she was not to be deterred. If they wouldn't make things happen, then we must try. Looking around the restaurant, she said, "We'll join the merry-go-round. We will invest that money for a year, being seen in the right places at the right time with the right people. I will accompany you and arrange everything." I looked around the restaurant and recognized many well-known faces and many unknowns doing their damnedest trying to be recognized. I have never forgiven myself for my thoughtless response to her loving concern for me. "My dear," I said, "don't waste your money. I'm no good at these charades. All I shall ever be able to count on is my talent." We didn't exchange another word until we got home. Then we had a flaming row, our first since we'd known each other. "Nothing will count with you," said Edith, "until you get that working-class chip off your shoulder. You're not working class anymore. You earn £4,000 a year. It's your father who still has to drive the trolley bus." So investment in the merry-go-round never took place. But for the sake of our future relationship, I should have been honest with Edith and given my true reason once and for all. I didn't need or want her father's money to influence my career, or my family for that matter. Michael Benthel, a well-known theatre director, told me he had just returned from America and was crossing Leicester Square when he saw my photograph, among others, outside the Leicester Square cinema, advertising a film, Trotty True. It was seeing the photograph that gave him the idea of phoning my agent to inquire if I might be interested in playing Touchstone in As You Like It, presented by the New York Theatre Guild, starring Katharine Hepburn as Rosalind. It was to open in the late autumn of 1949 with a tour prior to a short season on Broadway. Well, I wasn't interested. I was enjoying family life and reveling in my new role as a father. Furthermore, I had no experience whatsoever of classical theatre. Since our difference of opinion and my refusal of the offer to be seen in the right places, there had been very little discussion between Edith and me regarding my work. But this sudden American offer seemed to reawaken her interest and faith in me. Thank heavens. She vigorously remonstrated with me over my negative attitude while at the same time breastfeeding Tommy, as a result of which he kept losing her nipple, which did not please him. However, regardless of her son's annoyance and frustration, she managed to convince me that I should at least see Michael Benthel to discuss the matter. During our meeting, he told me that in his endeavor to cast the role of Touchstone, he must have met every top comedian in America, including Buster Keaton. He went on to ask me if I had seen the play. I told him just once, and I hadn't been impressed. As an afterthought, I felt I should add it was the Sir Donald Wolfett Company. He smiled and commented, "Not a band of actors renowned for their ensemble playing. How was Touchstone?" "Very old," I replied, then compensated by adding that it had been during the war when there had been a shortage of everything, even actors. He was aware of my total lack of experience in classical theatre, but this, he pointed out, was his exact reason for choosing me. "I want you to discover how to play Touchstone," he said. With that, he made me promise to give him my answer within 24 hours, and we parted company. That evening, I received a further lecture from Edith. I signed the contract. I would be away for the duration of the play's run, with a proviso from Rank that should I be needed for a movie, I would be released at once. My flight to New York was booked for the last week of October 1949. I was welcomed at the Algonquin Hotel, famed for its showbiz clientele, where, it is said, bad notices for a show could clear the supper room in a flash. But the welcome didn't last long when I discovered that I could only afford the room. Eating was going to be out of the question. I promptly removed myself to a dump on 7th Avenue called the Wellington, with a room like a broom cupboard. So came the first day of rehearsal, where Kate introduced me to my fellow actors, including, to my surprise, another guest actor from England, Ernst Thesiger, who was to play Jacques. Kate informed me confidentially that he was a master of petit points and had often practiced with Queen Mary. We very soon discovered that he and I had very little in common. In fact, I can only recall our ever having one conversation, which took place as we accompanied each other across Boston Common in the small hours after a party. It was at this social gathering that Kate introduced me to Spencer Tracy, in whose presence I thought she behaved rather like an adolescent schoolgirl. Or was I jealous? She worshipped him. We talked. Well, Kate talked, and I did my best. But Spencer made no effort whatsoever. Not a word. Then, apparently bored, he suddenly rose, turned to me and said, "You know your business," and joined some friends. Rehearsals did not begin well with my concept of Touchstone as a raunchy clown. That is, judging by the sighs of remorse and stage whispers emanating from the gloom of the auditorium of the theatre in which we were rehearsing. I particularly remember Act 3, Scene 3, where, in the forest, Touchstone tries to persuade Audrey, an innocent country wench, that her ignorance is a virtue. She prays that the gods will make her honest, to which Touchstone replies, "Truly, and to cast away honesty on a foul slut were to put good meat into an unclean dish." Saying this, I slapped her inner thigh. This almost brought on apoplexy somewhere in the stalls the first time I tried it. Kate was most receptive to any ideas I might have during rehearsal, but they were frowned upon by her drama advisor, Constance Collier. The other unseen voices were those of the New York Theatre Guild management, Teresa Helburn and Lawrence Langner, and I began to lose faith in me, which made rehearsals, as far as I was concerned, a waste of time. So the director, Michael Benthel, came to me and expressed the management's doubts over my interpretation of the role. We went back to my hotel, and after a couple of drinks, or perhaps more than a couple, I learned he was being told how to direct the play. I laid my cards on the table. Either he was going to make his own suggestions, or I would continue to try and find the way to play Touchstone, but without the assistance of an uninvited audience. I then saw that he'd fallen asleep. "I'm waiting for an answer," I yelled. He was immediately awake, and rising slowly, he unsteadily made his way to the bar, ordered more drinks, and proclaimed to the barman, "Let them go and shit. You play it as you want. Do you hear?" He then tottered out to find a taxi. The barman turned to me in astonishment, the first time I'd seen a human reaction from any member of the hotel staff. "Don't drink on an empty stomach," I warned, "particularly after a sticky rehearsal." And I, too, tottered off to bed. I had one further rub with the New York Theatre Guild during the New York run, which occurred when Kate was ordered to bed with a mild flu. Whilst the fully rehearsed understudy was ready to perform, the Guild felt, probably quite rightly, that without Kate, the patrons who had booked in advance would demand their money back, resulting in an immediate drop in attendance and possibly jeopardizing the future of the show. So they closed the play temporarily, only for a few days as it turned out. But it was then we were informed that everyone connected with the show would be paid during the closure, with the exception of the actors. I just couldn't believe this. Of all the people that might be essential to the curtain rising, surely the most important and indispensable were the actors, irrespective of the star. Whilst the attitude of the rest of the company seemed to be one of reluctant acceptance of resignation, I immediately sought out the company manager. I protested vehemently that I considered it a gross insult that the actors alone should be meted out such treatment, and that the British Actors Equity Association would never have agreed to such a state of affairs. He then informed me that I had signed an American equity contract, and whilst I continued to be employed in the States, I would abide by the rules. Furthermore, American Equity had agreed to this temporary arrangement, to which my reply was bullshit. It was whilst I was unsuccessfully trying to drum up some form of protest from the cast that an elderly actor playing a small role as one of the shepherds rebuked me most strongly with, "You are a guest in this company, and the only one protesting. We consider ourselves lucky to be working and grateful to the Guild for employing us." This angered me even more. I was probably only half his age, and it was beyond my comprehension that anyone should feel this mental kneeling necessary in gratitude for employment. In fact, after a lifetime as an actor, I sometimes wonder if I have ever been sufficiently in love with my profession. I always vowed it would never give me up. I would be the one to take the initiative if I thought it necessary. We opened at New Haven, Connecticut, to good reviews, houseful business, which was to be the pattern for the 8-week tour and the New York run. In fact, I believe we set a record for the longest-running Shakespeare play on Broadway. I wonder if it still stands. I also remember that on that first night in New Haven, Michael gave the most peculiar director's note I've ever heard in my life. We were all waiting to make our entrance for the second act when he appeared, wreathed in smiles, saying, "It's going wonderfully. Now get on and off as quick as you can." My press was good, and there were 2 notices that gave me particular pleasure. The Boston Record said, "Another deposed sissy in Touchstone. Owen praised him for the manly wiseacre he is, rather than the uppity-voiced daffodil you usually see." And a notice in the Pittsburgh Sun read, "Into Touchstone the clown, Mr. Owen pumps vibrant life and perhaps even more wit than his creator might have thought possible." Our New York opening at the Court Theatre was the night of that Broadway season. Hollywood was represented by all the glamour and glitz one associates with such an occasion. It was after an excellent reception, the flowers, the kissing, and the congratulations, that the final curtain fell, and as I hurried to my dressing room, a voice inquired of me, "Where is Kate's dressing room?" I turned. It was Cary Grant. Backstage was suddenly alive with these familiar faces, people I had known only from my seat in the local Odeon, and here they were, like Kate, for real. Robert Ryan, Gideon Rogers, Van Heflin, and Uncle Tom Cobley and all. But after the celebrations came the reality of settling down to what was obviously going to be a long run. Although the contract I signed was for the run of the play, it was understood in good faith that I would be away for no longer than 5 months. This had been promised by Michael Benthel at our first meeting. Yet after 7 months, I was still playing in the biggest hit on Broadway. But I was missing my family, particularly Edith, and celibacy didn't come easy. Such was my nature at the time that I had to be in love, surrounded by those who loved me. The total monotony of my room and the life on a tight budget in New York City was the surest way of becoming an introvert, even for hardened New Yorkers. So began a kind of monastic existence, never leaving the hotel other than to eat in some cheap diner, killing the hours until it was time to head for the theatre. And even backstage, amongst the friends I had, I began to make excuses to avoid any social invitations, under the delusion that my melancholy was apparent to no one but myself. There was a temporary respite, however, and a return to normality when Edith phoned to say she could not stand our separation any longer. She had, she said, with Zadok boarding school, made arrangements to park Tommy and a nanny with her parents in Scotland. She would be with me within a week. I don't know how long we clung to one another when I met her at the airport, and even when our irate taxi driver came to look for us, I was too happy to mix words with him. I had taken an apartment for a week up on Central Park, and it was like being on honeymoon, the one we never had. Edith saw the show as a guest of the management, after which we had a candlelight supper at the plaza. It was during the meal that the thought crossed my mind, how could I possibly cope again without her? Then, as suddenly as she'd appeared, she'd gone. Everything seemed dark again. That was until a miracle happened a week or so later. A letter arrived from Anthony Darnborough, a producer with rank, informing me that my presence was needed for a film and I should return as soon as possible. It was too good to be true. I was informed by the management that it was their intention to close the show in 6 weeks. I had already tendered my obligatory fortnight's notice, so what had this to do with me? They explained that Kate had refused to play with an understudy for longer than 2 weeks, which meant that after I left, in 2 weeks' time, the show would have to close early. Whilst this might sound like a backhanded compliment, the reality was that this company of actors, who began as complete strangers and had become such good friends, would now lose 4 weeks' work. So I stayed for another 2 weeks, which seemed like 2 years. As I sat waiting for the takeoff, my mind wandered back over the past 9 months, and I asked myself, had anything been achieved? Then I thought of my fellow actors, and of course my wonderful Kate, and decided to put it all down to experience, but not to be repeated for a long, long time. My thoughts were interrupted by a latecomer being hustled to his seat, who, from a fleeting glance, I thought I recognized. Then I did something I've never done on an aeroplane since. I fell asleep. The stewardess awakened me as we touched down at Goose Bay. It was then I saw the latecomer again as he passed along the gangway, and I knew I had to introduce myself. He had almost reached the reception hut when I caught up with him. "My name is Bill Owen," I said. "I'm from the Unity Theatre, Mr. Robeson." The moment I mentioned Unity Theatre, Paul's face lit up, and very soon we were back on the plane sitting in the little bar. His playing at Unity had obviously left a great impression, and I sat answering endless questions. I gathered he was on a visit to London to speak at some congress or other. Things back in the States had not been easy for him of late. I had read a vilifying attack against him in the New York Journal-American, a Hearst newspaper, alongside of which was an article hailing Senator McCarthy for having named 2 pro-communist State Department employees. There was evidently a division of opinion among the left themselves as to exactly what Paul's political role should be, or whether he should even have a political role. Some argued that it would be better if he confined himself to singing for the cause of racial equality in America. When he returned after this trip, the pressures really began. Attempts to restrict his travel were finally successful. He was banned entirely from the National Broadcasting Corporation, which began with the cancellation of a show in which he was to appear as a guest of Eleanor Roosevelt. Paul Robeson was a man of such overwhelming talent that some considered it greater than his cause. This he denied, and surely demonstrated as much throughout his life. I took my time getting used to being a family man once again, enjoying my son, for instance, a bundle of joy scurrying around the house on his bum with such speed and unerring sense of direction, but hardly to be recommended after the age of 18 months. Then there was Edith. She and I had so many things to catch up on, some with more priority than others. So I took my time. But the fact could no longer be ignored that after 3 weeks I had still heard nothing about the forthcoming film which had been the cause of my hurried return home. I rang my agent, who had heard nothing about it at all. "I didn't even know you were home," he cried. "Why doesn't someone tell me what's going on?" To save any further hysterics, I promised to ring him back. But what was going on? The answer came from an unexpected source when Edith admitted to a mild deception. Staying with me in New York, she had become increasingly concerned at the obvious stress I was living under. And this had been brought to a head when, over supper at the Plaza, I told her I could easily leave the play and return to England with her. "And I would have taken you," she said. "You were like a ghost of the man that I had married." When she got home, she immediately rang Anthony Darnborough, who, as well as being a producer with the Rank Studios, was an acquaintance of ours. Explaining her concern, she had asked him to write to the New York Theatre Guild requesting my return, as there was a film for which I was needed. This he did, and home I came. I don't think I have ever loved any woman as much as I loved Edith as she made her confession. Unity Theatre threw a welcome home shindig. Everyone was there, everyone I had worked with, argued with, and felt so at home with. We sang, danced, and drank. In the midst of it all, Mick Manning, probably the best General Secretary Unity Theatre ever had, and I laid the foundation for my idea of doing a show based on the history of British music hall, more of which later. I must admit to no surprise when my agent informed me that the option on my contract would not be taken up by the Rank organisation. Why should they? The only film in which I had starred was When the Bough Breaks. I had also featured in Easy Money, Trotty True, and Once a Jolly Swagman. But they never knew what to do with me, and no one really had the time or inclination to find out. I suppose I should have simply acknowledged the fact that the party was over. When I became a contract player to J. Arthur Rank, he owned 140 of us. When I left, there were fewer than 20. I have to confess that I was not so much concerned with any artistic failure as the grim reality, almost panic at the fact that the regular work or not paycheck had ceased. Following a visit from Edith's parents, to see your wee hoose, as old Tom put it, although I was sure he was just making certain I was doing the right thing by his daughter. So I was not surprised to receive a letter from him suggesting the house might be too small for us. Why, he asked, shouldn't we have the pleasure of a bigger and nicer one, with him paying the difference, as he concluded, a late wedding present? Edith, who had never gone along with my suspicions of her father's motives, was all for accepting his generous offer. I, on the other hand, was adamant that we should refuse it. She accused me of working-class snobbery, and she was right. I had no logical explanation for my attitude then or now. Old Tom was offering to buy us a house as a wedding present, in spite of my suspicions of ravings of, "Who's running our family, us or your father?" But the bare facts were that a larger house would be better for the children, and I wouldn't be encumbered with a mortgage. Sanity prevailed. I pocketed my working-class snobbery and we moved to Highgate. But there were still doubts, lingering doubts that I would perhaps never be able to provide a suitable lifestyle for Tom Stevenson's daughter. And wasn't it my mother who had said, "You married out of your class, Billy"? It's a thought. So, having no interest in gardening or pottering in the woodshed, keeping fit, becoming a mason, or even pursuing serious infidelity at the time, I went back to Unity and began research for the show I mentioned earlier, A History of the Music Hall. This took me to the British Museum Library, where for 3 weeks I found peace and contentment. A refuge I recommend to anyone who wants to get away from it all. This was my first experience of serious research, and whilst I'd had no idea where to begin, I was determined it wasn't going to be just another old-time music hall with usual ballads by Florrie Ford, Gus Elan, etc. I found that it was around the middle of the 19th century that harmonic evenings held in a few inner London taverns with music entertainment given by the regulars or local talent had become extremely popular. It was Charles Morton, the licensee of the Canterbury Arms in Pimlico, who had the idea of building a large room attached to his tavern to accommodate an ever-growing audience. In fact, the room became a hall big enough to hold over 1,000 people, thereby heralding the music hall. I also discovered the score and libretto of a short entertainment described as a burletta, of which the Oxford Companion of Music says, "In 18th century Britain, the word was applied to a light type of musical entertainment, something of the type of ballad opera." So the Unity show began with a burletto, followed by a harmonic evening at the Canterbury Arms. The second part was devoted entirely to the music hall, where chaos reigned for several minutes as the stage was invaded by suffragettes. With the perfect title, Winkles and Champagne, from the book by Wilson Disher and directed by yours truly, it was to prove another triumph for Unity Theatre. It remained in the repertory in various guises until the theatre's destruction by fire in November 1975.
That's the end of Side 2.